What's up guys, it's River, and today we're looking at the camera that the internet loves to hate, the Nikon D7500. I know this camera gets a ton of flack, but in actuality is a very respectable photo camera at a very affordable price. So let's do a deep dive, see exactly what makes this camera special, exactly what this camera does, and why it might just be your new photo camera. Let's get into it. Also, if you guys are interested in this beast of a camera, there's a link in the description down below for the absolute best pricing on it. So let's get right into what matters. This camera supports a 20 megapixel APS-C size sensor and a very respectable image processor. Now, considering what else is on the market, I would hope that the sensor was closer to 24, 25, but to be honest, 20 megapixels is plenty, and you're really not gonna notice those 4 megapixels. When it comes to Nikon cameras, they make very good sensors that really deliver very good image quality, and this camera is no difference. In this case, I would really say it's about the quality of the megapixels, not the quantity of the megapixels. So this camera, I would say, gives you very good image quality, and you will not notice those 4 extra megapixels. Plus, the image processor in this camera is very good. It gives you very clean images, and it gives you clean images all the way up to ISO 6400. Giving you very good results in low light, and that's very respectable and kind of impressive considering the fact that this is an APS-C size sensor and the price point of this camera. Let's talk about photos with this camera, because that's where I think this camera really shines. Like, considering the price point, this camera is a shooting beast. Check this out. That thing will keep going. It does 8 frames per second up to 50 shots. Most cameras in this price range will do like 15 or 20 at like 5 or 6 frames per second, and then it'll just need to pause for like a minute to a minute and a half for it to process and save all those images. To get this much of a shooting speed at this price point is pretty impressive. You can do wildlife with that, sports photography, model, fashion, anything you want. That thing makes it a beast. Plus, this shooting speed paired with Nikon RAW, you're gonna get all of your stuff with great dynamic range, great color, sharp, tons of clarity. Like, this thing is really good as a photo camera. If you're a beginner or a hobbyist, this camera will not let you down. There's literally nothing in terms of photos that's holding you back from creating awesome work. The only person that I probably wouldn't recommend this to, if you're getting your work printed out to billboard size. Now, most billboards, 20, 25 megapixels should be just fine. But if you're a professional doing magazines or billboards, chances are you're gonna need more megapixels to do retouching, and chances are you're gonna crop into your image when it goes to the billboard. So if you're a professional, I'd go with a higher megapixel camera, but for most of us, like 95, 98% of you guys, this camera will be fantastic for you. Next, let's talk about video. This camera surprisingly keeps up. You get a 1080p image up to 60 frames per second, so you do get a bit of slow motion, and you get 4K, though sadly with a 2x crop, but with the right lens selection, that's an easy issue to navigate around. As for the actual image in the camera, you get a very nice image, clean, low noise floor, overall a very appealing image, but I wouldn't use it for cinematic work, mainly because there isn't a cinematic profile built into this camera, so whatever you shoot in camera is kind of what you're locked into, and you can't really tweak your colors in post to really like adjust and get a cinematic look out of this camera. But I think this camera should be fine for corporate weddings and like conferences. Also, a quick side note, this camera has a built-in time-lapse mode. So without an external intervalometer or remote, this camera will do time lapses for you. What I really like about this camera is that this has very good metering. So it's very good at exposing every single shot, so you don't get any flickering in your time lapse. As a time lapse machine, if you just want to use this for time lapses, this thing is pretty decent. Next, let's talk about autofocus, because that is where this camera gets most of its flack. The reason this camera gets so much flack for autofocus is because it uses contrast-based autofocus, but I don't think that's the full story. Here's what I mean. This camera has 51 points of autofocus, and yes, there are contrast, but it also has face detect and 3D tracking, which are excellent. So yeah, contrast detection, it's a little bit slow, it's kind of hit and miss, but I use 3D tracking and face tracking for most of it. So if you're shooting models, you're totally fine. If you're shooting sports, you're totally fine. The only time that I can really see this being an issue is wildlife, because you're trying to catch something and it might run away. Yeah, for that, I wouldn't recommend this camera. And if you're doing landscapes, you're not in a rush. You're shooting a mountain. That thing isn't going anywhere for millions of years. I think the whole autofocus thing has been overblown. The only place where I can kind of see what people mean is the fact that this autofocus really isn't that great in low light, but that's kind of just Nikon cameras in general. They're really not good in low light. You have to have the proper lighting. Nikon really focuses on studio photographers more than run and gun, nighttime photographers, if you will. If you really want a camera like that, and I think it's totally fine if you do, you should really look into like a Sony or a Canon camera. Canon has fantastic dual pixel autofocus, and Sony literally has an AI based autofocus. When it comes to autofocus, I don't think Nikon cameras are the strongest, but when it comes to this camera, I think it's pretty decent. I'd give it 8 out of 10 because of the face tracking and 3D tracking. It's pretty decent, I would use it. Also guys, a quick tip, this camera does have something called a modeling flash, that little yellow light right there. So if you do need to shoot in low light, turn that modeling flash on and it'll give your camera just enough light to catch autofocus. Again, that autofocus stuff is kind of blown out of proportion. You will be just fine with this camera. Next, let's talk about audio in this camera. The internal audio in this camera is completely trash, but I don't think anyone's looking to this camera for internal audio. It's not really a vlogging camera, but it does have an input jack for external audio. So if you want to shoot interviews, weddings, conferences with this camera, that option is available to you and you'll be just fine. I've heard some people say this camera doesn't have very good audio preamps, but I listened to them and I thought they were totally fine. If you plan to use this as a corporate filmmaking camera and record the audio internally, I think you'll be just fine and you really don't have to worry about anything. Next, let's talk about design and ergonomics of this camera. So first of all, it's designed really, really well. I feel like all the buttons are exactly where they should be. My hand can easily navigate the entire camera. I feel like it's just an easy and seamless process to use. Like with Sony cameras, as much as I love Sony cameras, you kind of have to struggle through the menus and struggle through the buttons sometimes. But with this, I feel like it has very, very simple menus, easy to navigate buttons, and overall, it's a very, very well-built camera. This thing feels solid, robust. I actually feel like I'm using a professional tool. This camera just feels like it can go anywhere and I can really put it through its paces. On top of that, what makes me feel really safe with this camera is the fact that it's weather sealed. A lot of times with more affordable cameras, I'm worried about getting them wet or getting dust inside of them, but this camera is weather sealed and I really feel like I can take it anywhere. However, I have two small points of contention with this camera, and I realize I'm nitpicking, but I want to give you guys the best information possible. The two things about this camera that I don't completely love is the fact that it doesn't have a scroll wheel on the back. And now a scroll wheel is something that maybe not everybody needs, but I feel like it'd just be better for navigation. However, this camera has a touchscreen on the back, which I think is the reason they didn't put a scroll wheel in, but I don't think Nikon does scroll wheels. But that touchscreen overall is very, very quick. It's easy to navigate, and I pretty much feel like I've never really had an incident where I've tried to hit one thing and I've hit something else by accident. And the other problem that I have with this camera, now this doesn't always happen, but sometimes when I go into the menus, I'll see like a little hourglass and it takes like maybe just a split second to open up that menu. I'm not really sure why that happens, but often I find if I turn the camera off and on, sometimes I'll get that menu. I don't know if the camera's booting up or warming up or something, but I do notice every now and then I'll get this little hourglass, and that can slow you down, especially in a professional environment. But other than that, I would give the design of this camera like 9.7. If it wasn't for the scroll wheel or the hourglass issue, this camera is honestly perfectly built. And a quick side note, I recently reviewed the Nikon D850, which is like a $4,000 camera. And I actually feel like the ergonomics on this camera are slightly better than that camera, simply because of this mode dial. With this mode dial, I feel like I can easily switch my modes and just get the camera into the position that I want it to. With the Nikon D850, you gotta hold down a mode button here and then turn another wheel here, which I feel like is more work. So to be honest, this has better ergonomics than a $4,000 camera. Also, a quick thing that I forgot to mention, this camera has really, really impressive battery life. It has a 1900 milliamp hour battery, which is about the size of your iPhone. This battery has lasted me 3 days and I've been shooting on it nonstop. I'm super impressed with it. Now, I'm sure you can tell, I'm actually a huge fan of this camera, but I don't think this camera is right for everybody. If you're a photo person and really photos first, like that's the first thing you want to do, I really do think this is the best bang for your buck in this format. But if you're someone that does video and photo is more of an afterthought and you want a DSLR or like a mirrorless camera to really, really focus on cinematic filmmaking, I recommend pretty much anything out of the A7S line or the A6000 line. A6500 has built-in stabilization, has tons of cinema profiles, and you get 4K internally. Or the A7 III is fantastic. It's a full frame camera, so it is slightly more expensive, but you get 4K, slow motion, all that good stuff, and it has cinematic profiles. But if you want something that's a bit of a hybrid and a mix of the two, where you get pretty good photos and pretty good videos, I recommend looking at something like the Canon M50. Really good camera, does 4K internally with a slight crop, but the HD image out of that camera has great autofocus, great image, beautiful. You get a bit of slow motion in that camera. That's a very, very good camera. And it actually does 120 frames per second at HD. Or alternatively, if you want something that's slightly beefier in the photo department, I would look at the 5D Mark IV. It does pretty good, like 8 out of 10 photos, 8 out of 10 video, and it's kind of like a mix of best of both worlds, I guess. That's a really good camera. It is slightly more expensive, but if you want something that's really good at photos, really good at videos, that's probably the camera to get. But if you're someone that's mainly interested in photos, the Nikon D7500 is a very, very good option, and it's really the best bang for your buck on the market right now. Overall, I think the Nikon D7500 is a fantastic deal. Specs-wise, as a photo camera, you are really not held back in any way. It does great low light, you get very nice, clean images, you get raw. I know some people might be like, it's only a 20 megapixel sensor, but trust me, you're not gonna miss those 4 megapixels. You're just not. And considering the price of the camera and what you get, I think this is a fantastic deal that anybody who's starting out or a hardcore hobbyist should definitely pick up this camera. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us on our Nikon D7500 review. I hope you guys got a lot out of it. If you are interested in this camera, be sure to check out the link in the description down below for the absolute best pricing on this beast, so be sure to check that out. And if you have any questions whatsoever about this camera or anything else that we discuss on this channel, hit me up in the comments down below and I'll make sure to get back to every single one of you. As always, like and subscribe for future content. Until next time, guys.